It's still good morning for me. It is about 11:45 in the morning on Monday. I was making this recording from my kitchen table. Today, I want to move to more modern history, and I want to talk about really the two failed republics, the third and the fourth in the modern era. So, uh, in your notes, this would start with the significance of the Third Republic. I want to add a few things to what is in the notes that you have in front of you. The first is keep in mind uh, that the Franco-Prussian War, which broke out in 1870, was the third and last war that united the German states under Prussian leadership. So we'd already had a war with Denmark and Austria, and in this particular case, the Prussian forces were fighting against France. Uh, at the time that the war broke out, keep in mind that France was being governed by a monarch, by Napoleon III, and the French were really devastated in this conflict. The Prussians defeated the French quite easily. There were 187,000 battlefield deaths, 140,000 of them were French. And at the end of the war, we get a unified Germany, which of course later is going to create quite a problem for the French because a unified Germany becomes the new dominant kind of superpower in the region. And of course, in the 20th century, Germany is going to be involved in a war with the French in both World War I and World War II. But for right now, I want to back up to the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War. So the French are defeated. Germany takes two French provinces, the Alsace and Lorraine regions. With the defeat of Napoleon III, we get, surprise, a new constitution. And we get a new republic, the Third Republic. And as your notes point out, this is the longest lasting political regime uh, since the French Revolution. So we have all of these oscillating governments, governments that often last for a decade or 2 decades, and in many cases less than a decade. But the Third Republic lasts for 70 years. But keep in mind that this political system was created because of a military defeat to the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War. So this governmental system is created out of military defeat. And then 70 years later, in 1940, this political system ends because of another military defeat to Nazi Germany in 1940. Once again, just adding a few things to your notes here. Keep in mind that uh, during the Third Republic, political leadership um, was lacking on a long-term basis. Prime ministers kind of came and went. Remember, the emphasis was on equality and not on social order, and I'll go into some detail about this later. Unfortunately, the lack of executive leadership really manifests itself, unfortunately, during some times of crisis, and I'll give you an example. Later in the course, I'm going to have you read an article that I wrote in Political Science Quarterly if you want to uh, go ahead and look it up. It's in the spring 1991 edition of Political Science Quarterly. My co-author is Alexander J. Groth, who was my mentor. And in it, we talk about the failure of the French to respond during the Rhineland crisis of 1936. So Hitler uh, violates a whole variety of treaties. The Versailles Treaty and the Locarno Treaty of 1925 come to mind most notably. But everyone recognizes that Hitler's remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936 is a violation of international law, that it is a grave threat to French national security. And unfortunately, because of the political paralysis that existed in France, and because of a real lacking of executive power, the result in France was verbal protest. The French tried to get the British to come and aid them. Remember that the British in 1935 had promised not to rearm. The British had an election in 1935 in which they basically said that they believed that Hitler was a guarantee for peace. And in this case, the British told the French that they could not be goaded into any kind of provocative action because this might infuriate the Germans and Hitler. And then the British told the French that in our mind, the Rhineland is really legitimately a German territory, that the Germans are merely reoccupying their own territory, and that essentially no great harm had been done. And of course, the French, without the backing of the British, were unwilling to respond. And so many historians believe that the Rhineland crisis in 1936 was a political signal to Hitler that the democracies in the West, that the British, that the French were unwilling to respond even when they were the stronger power in Europe. And as a result, Hitler became increasingly emboldened to take on more and more provocative steps in places like Austria and Czechoslovakia and others. And so, to me, the failure to respond to Hitler was the absolute gravest weakness of the Third Republic. And Roskin really doesn't talk about that very much. And so I thought that I would add to that. Now, the one thing that Roskin does point out during this time period is when World War II breaks out, really the only successful French military commander was Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle was a tank commander, and tank commanders were actually manifest throughout multiple countries. In fact, the tank becomes the dominant weapon during the Second World War. And so you see Montgomery in England, you see de Gaulle in France, you see Patton, obviously, in the United States, and Rommel in Germany. De Gaulle actually is the only French commander that launches a fairly successful counteroffensive against the Germans. And if he had gotten some help, he might have broken the supply line. And again, this goes way beyond your book, but he developed quite a reputation during the war, and his leadership as a tank commander was remembered, of course, later when he becomes a political leader. As your notes point out, de Gaulle saw the haunting weakness of the Third Republic. He believed that the failure to respond to Hitler early, when it might have been successful, was because of these unstable governing coalitions. He also believed, being a good conservative, that what France really needed was a more rational parliament. He needed to do something to avoid these splintered parties that were resulting in instability. And most importantly, what France needed was a great executive officer. And of course, he was thinking of himself when he was thinking about this. And it is kind of intriguing that when the Fourth Republic does fall apart, de Gaulle essentially is writing a constitution for himself. Your book mentions how France was split again during the Vichy regime. It's unfortunate that in Vichy France that you have uh, French collaborators who are sympathetic to the Nazis. They actually send many Jews off to the death camps. They're complicit in this conspiracy with the Germans. And this is where I'd like you to reread the box that's in your chapter called The Dreyfus Affair, because a lot of students are surprised by the anti-Semitism that existed in France. The thinking was that the anti-Semitism only existed in Germany, but anti-Semitism existed for a long, long time in France, and you see that with the Dreyfus Affair. Dreyfus is a Jewish officer. He is accused falsely of collaborating with the German government. He was found guilty in a very rigged trial, and I added to the box by saying that when he was paraded before a crowd, the crowd was chanting "Death to Judas, death to the Jew." And even though later he was pardoned and later exonerated, this really horrified a lot of people, most notably Theodor Herzl, who founded the Zionist movement and became kind of the leading advocate for a Jewish state, which of course eventually resulted in the creation of a Jewish state, that being Israel. Now, to be fair, while many collaborated with the Nazis, there were many resistors that sabotaged and attempted to undermine the Nazis. And one example of this would be the communists. After World War II, initially the leading political party of the left are the communists. And the reason for this is that many of the communist political leaders had been in the resistance, had risked their lives fighting Nazi Germany. And so in the years of the Fourth Republic, and even to a lesser extent in the early years of even the Fifth Republic, the Communist Party was a significant political party because of their resistance to Nazi Germany. Now, the last thing in your history notes deals with the Fourth Republic, and as your notes point out, the Fourth Republic in many ways resembled the Third Republic. The parliament was all powerful. There was only a very weak prime minister. Political parties were very polarized, 27 different governments in only 12 years. And so this again is what de Gaulle is going to respond to. He sees once again a lack of political response to decolonization. So there is a disaster in French Indochina. The war in Vietnam goes quite poorly, and in 1954, the French bail out. The real killer of the Fourth Republic, of course, was an Algerian crisis where there was a threat of a military coup. And so, based on this Algerian crisis, de Gaulle, who for many years had been the best known critic of the Fourth Republic, was given full power and authority to revise the Constitution in the summer of 1958. He did this. He drafted a new constitution. This constitution was submitted to the voters. We call that a referendum. And the voters in the end of 1958 ratified the creation of this new constitution that was very different than anything France had ever seen. We have a fifth republic, and the first one that is modeled by conservatives. And so de Gaulle is going to create a republic that has a very strong executive officer, a strong president. He is going to go to those single member district elections instead of proportional representation to kind of narrow the playing field for political parties. And so this Fifth Republic is going to have much more an emphasis on order and stability and a little less on equality. And we'll talk about the Fifth Republic in the next lecture.